Well, I don't know if you know this about me, Anna. I think you do, but I've been known to pick up a guitar here and there and strike up a tune, shred like hell and melt some faces. Yeah. And last month, those of us in the guitar playing community, the ones who have a subscription to Guitar World magazine still and know who Joe Satriani is, got a little bit of news.
Taylor Guitars in El Cajon is transitioning to 100% employee ownership.
Yes, Taylor Guitars is going to be owned by its employees. That's pretty cool. That's interesting. Now, for those of you who don't know much about guitars, Taylor is one of the most famous manufacturers of acoustic guitars.
This is one of the biggest guitar factories in the United States. Taylor Guitars was founded by Bob Taylor and Kurt Listug in 1974. That's fairly new considering some of its competitors like Gibson or Martin Guitars. Today, big music names like Taylor Swift, Jason Mraz, and Zach Brown strum to the tune of a Taylor guitar.
Yeah, they're considered some of the best guitars you can find. I mean, Taylor Swift plays Taylor, so they're good. And as of last month, the company's fate is going to be in the hands of its 1,200 employees, most of whom work at the factories in El Cajon, California, or Tecate, Mexico. And that sounds kind of cool, right? I mean, one of the central problems with capitalism is that most of us have to work for private companies that are owned by people who are not us. We create value for those companies in exchange for a wage, except the value we create is greater than the wage we get in return. And that difference is what we call profit. And all of that goes to the people who own the company. So if the employees own the company, then the value they create for the company ultimately goes to the people who work for it. Now, it's worth clarifying a few things. Taylor did this through something called an ESOP, or Employee Stock Ownership Plan. This is not, to be clear, a worker co-op, at least not for now. But what it does ensure is that Taylor will not be sold to, say, someone like a private equity firm.
Now tell me about the transition to 100% employee ownership. Why did you guys decide to do this, Kurt?
Well, we know that we won't live forever, and we would like the company to continue beyond us. So we have the responsibility to put the company in the right hands. And our choices were kind of limited. It was keep it in the family. I don't have kids. Bob has a couple of adult daughters. They weren't interested in being in the guitar business. We could have sold to another guitar company or a financial firm, but those were both distasteful to us. We thought our guitars would suffer in quality. We thought the business would kind of go downhill. So the best choice for us was we looked at who helped us get to where we are and who most deserved it, and that was our employees. So we found a way to structure an employee stock ownership plan, and we sold the company to that, and the employees now are inheriting the company.
So you've heard this story before, right? Company is healthy and successful and maybe even beloved. It then gets sold to a private equity firm who then squeeze out as much value in the short term as they can, ruining the company in the process and laying off all its workers. A recent example of this is Fairway Markets in New York. This is from The Atlantic's write-up of that story. The story is a familiar one, even for shoppers hundreds of miles from the nearest Fairway. Most consumers have seen some of their favorite chains like Toys R Us, Shopgo, Claire's, Payless Shoe Source, Nine West, Gymboree, Staples, and A&P, among many others, face financial distress and shutter some or all of their stores. Like Fairway, these businesses were owned by private equity, a form of finance in which investors buy, overhaul, and then sell companies. Also, like Fairway, the other retail chains were profitable at the time they were taken over. Before those buyouts, these businesses had low levels of debt and owned their real estate, a necessary precaution for companies suddenly facing more competition or industries seeing widespread changes. Taylor, for their part, had low levels of debt and owned their real estate. The Atlantic continues, most companies mean to stay in business in the long term, And those in the industries most exposed to the business cycle know that low debt and no rent are the keys to surviving hard times and then prospering when the good times return. The motivation is very different for private equity owners, however, who operate under a much shorter time frame, often just 3 to 5 years before moving on. For them, low levels of debt and high levels of real estate ownership present a get-rich-quick opportunity. Basically, what they do is load these healthy companies up with debt, sell any of the assets they may own, and use their cash flow to pay themselves. It's one of those things that when you hear about it, you find it shocking that it's actually 100% legal. And had Taylor's founders sold to a financial firm, it's safe to assume that the company would not survive for long, precisely because they owned their factories and had healthy cash flows. The financial vultures would see that as an opportunity to pay themselves exorbitant dividends. Now, of course, it's worth mentioning that Taylor isn't the exception, not the norm. It's a company that makes a highly specialized artisanal product, and its founders clearly had other goals outside of the naked pursuit of profit in the short term. But that's always going to be an outlier in our system. That's why people like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn both included employee ownership plans in their respective campaigns for president and prime minister. Writing in Jacobin about Corbyn's plan, Peter Gowan writes, quote, "The inclusive ownership fund's proposal, drawing its name from much of its inspiration from a recent report by researchers Matthew Lawrence, Andrew Pendleton, and Sarah Mahmood of the New Economics Foundation, calls for transferring 10% of the equity in all British firms with over 250 employees into worker-owned and controlled funds over the next 10 years. The funds would pay out annual dividends of up to £500 and retain the remainder as a social dividend to buttress public services and reduce inequality." And for their part, Vox.com called Bernie's employee ownership proposal, quote, "his most socialist idea yet." I love that. Bernie's most socialist idea yet, explained from the good friends at Fox.com. Anyway, and like much things Bernie, he has been saying some version of this for a long, long time. Here he is way back in 2007.
This amendment would begin to reverse that trend by providing employees with the resources that they need to own their own businesses through employee stock ownership plans and eligible worker-owned cooperatives.
And here he is, way back in 1985.
But what we're talking about here is a new vision about the relationship of people to the work that they do. Now, the fact of the matter is that many of us work 40 hours a week, or 50 hours a week, or 60 hours a week, all over the United States of America. And we've become used to the way we relate to our employers. We understand and we accept it as a basic reality that we go to work for somebody else, that somebody else decides the kind of product that will be produced, how it will be produced, where it will be produced, and when it will be produced, and that somebody else has the right to say that, gee whiz, we can't make money in this town anymore, and we're going to leave and go to the Dominican Republic where we can get workers for $2 or $3 a day. Why do we have to pay all of $4 an hour when we can get cheaper labor abroad? I, the owner, will make that decision, and you, the worker, and you, the community that used to house this company or this factory or this office complex, tough luck. It's mine. I own it. I will do as I please.
You gotta love young Bernie. He still was already old at heart. Anyway, when we talk about politics, like we do on this show and like maybe you do in your life, what are we really talking about? I mean, if you really boil it down to its essence, politics is about who gets what in our society. As Marx said, it is a struggle between capital and labor. Capitalists, or the bourgeoisie, are those people who own things like companies or land. Labor, or the proletariat, are those people who do the work in exchange for a wage that the capitalist gives them. And a good way to look at that struggle in its most basic form is to see what percentage of the overall economic pie goes to capital and what percentage goes to labor.
Economists have a rule of thumb, I guess you might say, when it comes to economic growth, that the gains from that growth in terms of income tend to be split between labor and capital in a fairly standard way that doesn't change much over time. About 2/3 of income gains go to labor, and the bulk of the rest goes to capital, owners of businesses, owners of shares and equipment and things like that.
So the economist guy is right. The percentage of the income that goes to capital and the percentage that goes to labor had been relatively steady for a long time. 2/3 went to labor and 1/3 went to capital. Now, for us on the left, that was already intolerable because that 1/3 that went to capital was already way too much, given that it's not like 1/3 of the overall population were capitalists. It's in fact much, much smaller than that. But anyway, in recent decades, that intolerable situation has gotten worse.
Men and jobs are the essential basis of our modern America.
Interestingly, though, since about the 1980s, this sort of rule of thumb has really only been true in economics textbooks. For the past generation or so, the share of income that's been going to workers has been declining steadily. It was around 66% across rich countries in the 1980s. It's since fallen to about 62%. In Northern Europe, the declines have been especially large.
So what we on the left want to do is reverse that trend and increase labor's share of the pie at the expense of capital. Eventually, we would like it so that labor gets 100% of the pie. So how do we do that? Well, there are essentially two types of reforms that can do it. The first, and I think the most crucial one, is reforms that increase workers' power. The main way to do this is through labor unions. There are other things like putting workers on corporate boards like they do in Germany, but the main thing is unions. And this is still the most important thing that we need to focus on. The second is ownership reforms. Basically, who owns the firms? Eventually, we want the workers to own all of the firms. And there are several ways to do this. Matt Brunig talks about social wealth funds a lot, such as the one in Norway, and that does seem like a great thing. And there are also schemes like worker co-ops or ESOPs like what Taylor just did. And there are other examples of this around the world. My hometown of Miami has a pretty famous one. The public supermarket chain is actually majority owned by its employees. And the most famous example of a worker-controlled firm is Mondragon in the Basque Country in Spain. Now, I have to admit that when I saw this Taylor news, it put a smile on my face because I've owned Taylor guitars in the past and they really are great. And one of the contradictions of capitalism is that it often destroys things that people genuinely love. But Bob Taylor, for all that we love him, is no revolutionary, but he wants to keep his company going and he recognized that turning it over to Wall Street would mean the death of Taylor guitars. But no, this bit of fun, quirky news will not usher in a socialist utopia. But thinking about who owns the companies we work at is an important piece of the puzzle. And in the meantime, we can at least rest easy that we'll still be able to see geniuses like Michael Lemo from Norman's Rare Guitars in the Valley, incredible store, shred on this beautiful 12-string Taylor. I think if I just practiced a little bit more every single day, I could do that too.
Damn, Nando. Good job at increasing our female demo by that little snippet of you playing your electric guitar. That was nice. Great segment. Really, really good segment. I have to say, like, one thing that I think for people who want to promote the idea of worker co-ops, like, I think one of the takeaways is that when employees own the company, right, the stakes are higher. Like, it's not, you don't feel like you're just some, I don't know, sometimes with certain workplaces, you feel like you're just there to make the money that you're going to make, and you don't really have any type of sentimental tie to it. The stakes aren't really that high. You can, you'll either get fired or you'll quit and you'll move on. When you own the company, it's your baby, right? And so I feel like that mentality leads to more growth, because we hear about the importance of growth under capitalism all the time. But in a worker-owned co-op, I would argue that growth is much more likely when you have employees who own the company. The stakes are higher for them and they actually care about the success of the company.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Marx talks about, is that the workers are alienated from the work that they do because they understand on some intrinsic level that it's not that it's not for them, that the wage that they're getting in return is insufficient, to the value that they're creating, and that it's, like you said, it's just on a sort of more sentimental level. It's like, what do I care? Like if I bust my ass and make, a few more widgets in the widget factory, it's not gonna make a difference. The under capitalism, the real kind of driver is the threat of immiseration, right? Rather than like the sort of joy and work that you put into whatever it is you do. It's like, if you don't do this, you're going to be poor on the street and you're going to die. So that's the real motivating factor. And that's why people are miserable. Like that's why workers feel alienated from the work that they do. So again, like, I think that this story, I mean, I just did it because I thought it was fun, and it's a fun little story. I mean, it's not going to usher in the revolution or anything like that, but it's just an example of little things that can happen that will change the fundamental relationship that we have with the work that we do. I mean, that's why Bernie has been talking about this for so long. It's like, that on some fundamental level, if we own the companies that we work for, we feel like we're working for ourselves. And it's just that's just a different thing. Again, I still think that there's other
literally be more invested in the work that we
do.
Yeah.
Exactly. And of course, like, there's a million other things that need to happen for social progress. Again, like, I want to stress the most important thing is increasing labor power, like increasing labor unions and collective organization for workers to be able to exercise their rights and exercise their power and all that thing. That's still the most important thing. And, like things like what's going on in Bessemer, Alabama with the Amazon Union is like, that's the thing. This is kind of like another thing that also should be happening. But one shouldn't supplant the other, if that makes sense. Like it's supposed to be like a shared kind of goal.